Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, FinCyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Communications Officer at FS-ISAC. We're here filming at the America Spring Summit, talking to CISOs and cybersecurity leaders about the key issues and challenges they're facing. We caught up with Steve Sparks, CISO at Scotiabank and FS-ISAC board member, about the evolution of the role of the CISO. Thank you so much for being here with us, Steve. So, you've been around for a little while, like 35 years? I was told. I can't believe it.
Over 30 is my preferred politically correct explanation, but yes.
Over 30. Tell us how the role of the CISO has evolved over the last several decades.
Yeah, well, firstly, I wasn't a CISO. In fact, the role didn't even exist when I started my career in tech and finance. And it's something that has become increasingly prominent over the last sort of 15 to 20 years, I would say. And it's grown from being network security as a subset of infrastructure to being a much more prominent, much more expansive role over that time. And the nature of the role and the scope and scale has expanded dramatically in the last 10 years in particular.
And you did a presentation here at the summit, and I thought it was really interesting, where you said that, originally the majority of the role was technical oversight, and that has been slowly sort of crowded out by these other arenas. Can you go through, the graphic that you showed about that? Explain how that has worked in terms of the sectors.
Yeah. Well, I think most of the people that started off in a security or infrastructure with a security angle to it really enjoyed doing that, and they were more in the technical weeds, and whether it was configuring firewalls or figuring out how to defend an endpoint, that was really the origin of the discipline. And as these other requirements started to crowd in, the need for more internal reporting to educate other members of technology initially, and then more broadly across the management teams, as that time starts to leach away the time on the technical component of the role and the technical leadership of the teams, I think my initial response was just work harder, and eventually you run into the wall because there are just not enough hours in the week to be able to do that. And then you have to start thinking about, well, what am I going to give up? And how can I continue to drive a technical agenda without being so hands-on and so in the weeds? And it requires a lot more formality than a lot of people were used to doing, myself included. And when you can no longer be the team leader of an initiative, and you need to back up a level and say, okay, let's start talking about project planning, and let's start talking about resources, and let's start talking about timeframes and coordination with other groups. It really shifts the nature of what's in that technical leadership function from being so hands-on to being a little bit more removed, and it requires a shift in thinking and a change in perspective, which to begin with is a hard thing to adjust to, or at least I found it difficult to adjust to begin with.
Yeah, I would imagine that's hard, especially for CISOs who come from more technical backgrounds, to then have to pull back, and then spend more time around, stakeholder management and regulatory engagement. What are the components that, kind of the big picture components of the job now?
Yeah. Well, as it currently stands, a lot of it is internal stakeholder management in terms of other members of the tech teams, but also the senior leadership of the banks. And as the risk disciplines have emerged and operational risk has become a much bigger component of the risk agenda to sort of sit alongside market risk and credit risk, most banks have invested heavily in operational risk over the last few years because of external pressures, both the landscape and regulatory pressures. And so now there's an increasingly senior audience internally who want to know, is it safe? And if it's not safe, how much do we have to spend to make it safe? And how soon will it be safe? And so finding ways to map from the business understanding onto what is ultimately the technical environment, being the intermediary and figuring out how are you going to look for the signals and explain those signals in a consistent way to this larger audience than you've ever needed to deal with. That's one of the key shifts in the CISO's role over the last few years.
Let's talk about the regulatory side and how much time you and your team is spending on that. Is that also a growing component of the gig?
There is definitely an increasing need to engage with regulators, and it's super important to remember that their interests are the same as ours, in that we want to keep the ecosystem safe, and the time that is spent with them is actually often a good investment. Sometimes it feels like an onerous intrusion into what you're trying to get done, but mostly it's helping defend the sector. And it's non-discretionary time. You don't get to choose how much time you spend with them. You can try and make it as productive as possible. You can try and establish a discipline and a cadence so that they understand from a baseline, this is how you're making progress with a program. But if they want to do a spot inspection or a rapid horizontal, which is something that they are doing increasingly, then you just have to make that time available, and you have to plan for it in having a deep enough bench that regardless of how little time you have to prepare and respond, that you've actually got the capacity to meet your obligations to them. Because if you don't, then that's a bad fact pattern and creates, ironically, more work to get out of the hole that you find yourself in.
Right. And then the other component that I thought was interesting was the sort of increasing intersection between cyber and fraud, AML, and just, I guess, crime in general.
Yeah.
Talk about how that piece of your work is evolving.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting, and a lot of companies have different operating models where sometimes the consumer-facing application teams are responsible for consumer account takeover protection, and they might take advice from the cybersecurity organization, which is principally defending the enterprise rather than the client. But increasingly, there's a convergence as there's a growing understanding that the external threat intel from the dark web can be used broadly across all purposes. And when you're thinking about the protection that you offer to client-facing websites, it's often the cybersecurity team that understands the nature of the threats and the nature of the protection that you need. And so that convergence of fraud prevention, account takeover prevention, phishing attack prevention, those are all areas that are coming together. And some companies have adopted a fusion center model where they bring multidisciplinary teams together. Others, and we're in this category, have got a virtual fusion center where we're nominating somebody on a rotating basis from each one of the groups to be the leader for a duration for a 6-month period, so that someone from the cyber team is the fusion leader for 6 months, and then someone from the fraud team will be the fusion leader. And I think that will help us cross-pollinate the knowledge, but at the same time also preserve clarity. When we're in the middle of an incident, you want to know who's in charge, who's on first. And if you just have peer organizations, then it just slows down an incident response process. So I think that this convergence is going to happen across the industries, but how it happens in different firms will be down to the org structures that they have and the personalities of the leaders of those groups.
Yeah. Also, I heard that you also recently took over the infrastructure side of the house, I guess. So there's a convergence there as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that's going?
Sure. And this is a fairly recent development for us, but there is a very compelling driver, and I'm going to take a moment to step back to talk about a bit of an industry trend which we're leaning into, and that's the absolute imperative for scale in both banking and in cybersecurity. And that scale is something that, as the threats increase, the amount of money that we have to spend and the amount of resources that we have to devote to protection is just continuing to increase. We've increased over 30-ish% in the last couple of years, and that upward trend is driven by the need to protect an on-prem and a hybrid cloud environment, and that's a significant expense which is only going one way. And I think that the hyperscalers, so all of the cloud providers, have got the benefit of an enormous footprint to be able to amortize their security investments, and they're spending billions of dollars a year on security, and that's far in excess of what any individual company is going to be able to spend. So, and yet the threats are very similar. So we've made a strategic decision to adopt the cloud more aggressively and to move all of our enterprise data that matters and a significant amount of our workload to the cloud. We have a multi-cloud strategy, but in order to move this much workload, it's going to be essential to have a single coordinated set of priorities. And so by bringing the cyber agenda and the infrastructure agenda and IT risk and some of the corporate applications together in what we're calling enterprise platforms, that's a team that now has a single management structure, a single leadership hierarchy, and a single set of priorities to go after this migration. And it's going to be a big focus for the whole organization. And the cyber team can make sure that we're doing it in a safe way. The infrastructure team can make sure that this workload moves from the on-prem environment to the cloud as rapidly as we can. And the risk team will make sure that we do it in an appropriately prudent way. And that includes all of the asset disposal of the servers that are going to be orphaned as a result of the workload moving. We're going to have to manage the financial processes as we shift from the on-prem operating model to a cloud model where the expenses are dramatically variable, and need controlling in a way that we never needed to in the on-prem world. So
we kind of started talking about, so how do you think now about building your team to be able to successfully manage all of that, especially as you said, you can't be as hands-on technically as you once were, and I think that this is probably a trend that all CISOs are facing. So how do you think about building a team to be able to absorb this? I think all CISOs are facing more. It's just more.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you do it?
Yeah. You have to bring in or cultivate stronger leaders in your immediate organization. You need to empower the people that work for you in a way that perhaps wasn't needed in the past, and that's going to stretch people, and some people will need more coaching. Some people won't be able to make that leap in one go, and we may need to plug that gap with either external resources that have got the skills required to help provide that bridge to the next version of their roles. And across the organization, a lot of roles are going to change, and especially in the infrastructure space, when we're moving Linux and Wintel workloads to the cloud, we don't need the system admins that we used to have, but their roles, instead of being hands-on administrators of the environment, become they have to set the policies that will be enforced against the environments. They have to become service managers, and reskilling that population is a big part of the change agenda with help from the HR team. Other areas won't change, so we're still going to have endpoints, we're still going to have workstations, we're still going to have mobile devices, we're still going to have network access, we're still going to have branches. In our case, we've got thousands of branches. And so some parts of the roles won't change, but just helping everybody understand that here are the guardrails in which you're now going to need to operate. Here's how you're going to be measured and our performance is going to be assessed. And let's agree what those KPIs and KRIs are. And there's going to be a degree of formality around it that we didn't previously need to have. And that relationship between what are we doing with the environments that we manage versus what are we getting from the service providers, blending all of that to deliver a composite service to the institution requires a different set of skills. So being explicit about it and having those very direct conversations with people about, this is where we're going. Do you want to come with us? Or do you want to take a different path? In which case, let's have that mature conversation about how long are you going to be with us and what's your exit play? And just having that kind of engagement with the leadership is really crucial, I think. And treat them like adults, and they'll behave like adults.
So let's talk a little bit about where you see the CISO role going from here, AI, supply chain, regulatory landscape towards, let's say, the next 10 years.
Well, I think that the trend is going to continue. I think that company boards are getting increasingly interested in hearing from the CISO. I think that there's going to be, whether there is external regulatory pressure in the same way that the SEC has mandated that boards have cyber expertise, I think that that's going to become more prevalent across multiple countries. And I think that the standalone engagement of the CISO at the C level is going to happen. And I think that there are many organizations where it still either reports into technology in some way, or perhaps under risk or some hybrid thereof. And I think it's going to become a much more of a standalone function. And we've seen a model, Phil Venables at Goldman's role is probably a good one that most people will be familiar with. His role expanded from CISO to Chief Risk Officer as other components were added in there. And I think the recognition that cyber as an operational risk is one of the dominant risks and has a technical component to it that you have to understand means that the other components are going to be added to it. So I think that the CISO role is going to continue to expand in prominence. And I think that that's going to place a premium on communication skills and leadership skills in a way that is going to continue to accelerate. And so being able to distill a message for a senior audience and have the courage of your convictions to be able to describe a tough message in some cases, because you're not always delivering news that people want to hear, but it's still news, and you just have to help people understand how to react to it and how to handle it. I think it requires a ton of personal integrity, and it requires a degree of self-assurance, which is sometimes difficult to maintain depending on the circumstances. But I think that role, the personal qualities and the professional expertise, is going to just continue to be more demanding over time.
Speaking of demanding, I mean, one thing that comes to my mind is some of the recent personal liability issues around CISOs. Do you think it's going to be harder to attract great talent to even be CISOs?
I think it's certainly something that all CISOs are thinking about. And I think it really depends on the structure of the organization in which they work, whether or not they feel that they've got the appropriate air cover to be able to take a principled stand and maintain the consistency of interpretation of any particular risk between the team leadership and internal discussions, which are of necessity technical and detailed, versus the external representation where in order to convert what is a very arcane and hard to understand for most lay people technology set of risks into something that you can describe, there's a real hazard in that conversion. And I think most CISOs, certainly in regulated companies, are now engaging with their legal teams and their corporate comms teams to get some help with making sure that you're consistent, and at the same time you don't inadvertently create a disconnect between the two worlds. So I think a lot of the CISOs that I've talked to are clearly concerned about the increased personal exposure, and we've all as a group discussed how do you preserve that consistency and do it in a safe way. So I think the challenge that the industry has seen is that was quite a sudden change from the SEC and very specific, and I think it's going to take a little bit longer to see the impact on the industry overall, now that everybody's aware of this concern.
Yeah. All right. Some final words of inspiration for those who are not dissuaded and still would like to be a CISO. You've been doing this for a long time. Can you give some motivational words for those?
Well, I think it's one of the most. It is one of the more demanding jobs in a technology-related capacity, especially in the financial services industry, where you've got tons of regulation to be on top of all the time, and especially if you operate internationally, where there is not a great amount of consistency. But with those challenges comes reward, and you've got a breadth of activities that go into being a successful CISO, because you do still have some technical components, you've got a ton of leadership components, you've got a ton of financial management components, you've got the stakeholder piece that we've talked about, and you've got the external engagement and the opportunity to have a positive impact on an organization and make calculated risk decisions that will empower the business, not necessarily driving to zero risk, because that's not what any of the banks I've ever worked for. They don't seek zero risk. They are risk-taking engines. That's what they do. And being able to support that in a prudent and transparent way is, I find it tremendously satisfying, and it's one of the hardest combinations of roles to get right. But with that comes the highest satisfaction, I think.